Okay, I'm very excited to have on the Goldstein on Gelt show, Erin Lowry, who is a millennial personal finance expert. She wrote a book called Broke Millennial, Stop Scraping By and Get Your Financial Life Together. Now, Erin also, I understand, has a kind of interesting background. Erin, let's start by talking a little bit about where you grew up.
Sure. I was born in Houston, Texas. Then we moved to Reno, Nevada. Then we moved to Gastonia, North Carolina. And then when I was 10, we moved to Japan. And when I was 16, we moved to Shanghai, China. So lots of moving around, not military, because that's always people's first question. My dad actually works in the lithium industry. So that's why when I was 10 years old, we moved to Kobe.
So what was it like in Japan?
I loved it. It was such a great childhood, especially because it's so safe. There's such ease of public transportation that when you're 10 years old, you can be going places by yourself without your parents. So that kind of autonomy coming from having to be carpooled and shuttled around all the time as a kid in the States was unbelievable.
Wow, that's amazing. That's interesting. That's very much like it is in Israel, where when my kids were little and we would send them on buses and going all around, and their cousins in America would be like, really? We're not even allowed to go onto the front lawn to play unless a parent's there. So living overseas, you were a real expatriate. When you were 10 years old, let me ask you a question. What did you think about, I don't know, the taxation of U.S. expats?
Well, when I was 10, I definitely didn't know very much about it, but I started to hear murmurs over the years. It was always so interesting to me. I remember learning at a young age that, we still got taxed by America when we were living overseas. And I didn't have a lot of understanding of what that meant, nor empathy for the situation until I started earning my own income when I was a little bit older and back in the United States at that point. We did a couple of interesting things. And one was, I remember we moved from North Carolina. We sold the house. We had no ties to North Carolina. And my dad actually declared our legal residence as my grandparents' home in Georgia because from my understanding, and I could have this completely wrong after 18 years, I'm 28 now, but I remember hearing that Georgia did not tax expats with state tax while North Carolina did. So that was part of the reason that we switched residence. And then the funny way that impacted me is when I moved back to America at 18, I was the only one that was moving back. My family was all staying in China. But I really needed a driver's license. And the only option I really had to do it was to do it in Georgia because that's what we had declared our state residency. And I had no other place to identify as my home. So I had to get my driver's license in Georgia. The other interesting thing from a college perspective, I'm 18 years old. I'm applying to all of these universities. We've been paying taxes, but we don't have a state. I don't have state residence. And therefore, I had no option to go to a state school to keep college cheaper for me.
No kidding. Not even Georgia?
No. And I don't know if it's because I wasn't a resident there. My parents had only declared that for state and tax purposes. I have no idea. But yeah, they were like, sorry, you don't count.
Wow, that's so interesting. That means that people who leave the United States for a while and come back with kids are all of a sudden going to find that a lot of the normal sort of financial planning that people in America would do may not apply because if they don't live in the U.S., then they can't get, or in a specific state, you're saying they can't go to a state school and benefit from the lower tuition.
And that's my understanding. I'd be curious if now, I graduated from college in 2011, graduated high school in 2007, so a decade ago. Things might be a little different now, but I kind of doubt it. It was a very interesting financial choice that then had to be made. And North Carolina, especially, I left from North Carolina. There's great public schools for college in North Carolina. And I had to apply to all of them as an out-of-state option, which made it harder for me to get in, for one. For two, it didn't really make any financial sense. It was still insanely expensive compared to going to some private liberal arts college.
Have you found that having lived overseas, it's kind of helped you now that you're back in America?
Yes, absolutely. I think the biggest thing for me, there was definitely some reverse culture shock. It was a little hard to adjust because this was right before you had so much access on the internet. And also remember, China is still a communist country, so there are firewalls. I didn't have access to everything. But one thing that was very interesting coming back is, I didn't have FaceTime, didn't really have Skype. And so even having conversations with my parents and my sister were very difficult when I was in college in the early years. I had been cut off pretty much, except for the summers, from understanding a lot of American culture. So that was an interesting part of it. There was definitely a lot of growing pains there in the beginning. But for the most part, I had had so much exposure so young to so many different ways of thinking. And I went to a university that was in a small area of upstate New York with a lot of people who had truly not really left their towns. And maybe some of them had gone to Canada because it was close, but just into Toronto. So not a whole lot of global exposure. And it was amazing for me to realize, one, how things were taught in the United States, because I wasn't being taught by Americans at American schools. So my understanding of, for example, history was very different. I was taught from a very different scope of, lens. It was never, the very American focused version of history. And starting to unwrap these things as I was going through college and learning was just so fascinating. But then you also kind of have the flip side of, when I was young, I was in the South. So the version of history that I was learning in the South was very different in the context of American history than what I was learning both in college and then when I lived overseas. So it was just a bunch of very different forces that made it, at a young age, I was kind of able to disseminate how information is given to us, and how we kind of focus in. And then you grow up. You don't grow up fast in a negative sense when you live overseas, but you learn to be very independent very quickly. I'm so grateful for that, and it made my transition into adulthood, I think, a lot easier.
Wow. We're talking with Erin Lowry, who is the author of the book Broke Millennial, Stop Scraping By and Get Your Financial Life Together. She's been talking to us about what it was like to grow up outside the United States. Erin, a lot of the listeners to the Goldstein on Gelt show also live outside the United States. There are many, many of them live in Israel. One of the stories you told reminded me of a story that my daughter had when she was quite the entrepreneurial teenager. She started teaching online. She would teach Hebrew to people in America through one of these online schools. And it turned out, even though she was very, very young, she was their top Hebrew teacher. And she did quite well. She was really very successful. And then towards the end of the year, we said, okay, it's time that we go talk to the accountant. And she kind of looked blankly, thinking, this is only what grown-ups have to deal with. And we said, no, this is what you have to deal with. And because you're self-employed, you have to pay both the employer and the employee tax. So she ended up paying 15% of her income as self-employment tax. And that was a huge eye-opener. So I think that people who are living overseas, like you said, you learned about paying for college tuition the hard way. She had to learn about taxation the hard way. Now, Erin, one of the things that I know you focus on a lot in your day job, other than just talking to me, is dealing with millennials. Do you think that there are certain issues that millennials and younger people in general have dealing with money that kind of cross borders?
Well, certainly the lack of early education is a problem. And I think this can completely transcend borders. In the United States specifically, we definitely do have a big issue with the student loan debt and how many millennials are very heavily burdened at the moment. In 2016, the average grad walked with something around $37,000 of student loan debt, which personally I think is on the low side. And just based on people I talk to and my friends and people I know. But it's unbelievable here in the States how many people have that, they're shackled to these debts very early on. And then the problem there is that it kind of inhibits your career. You can't take the same risks early on because you just need a job that you can get a paycheck and you can put money towards your debt, which keeps you from being able to pursue maybe either your dreams or a job that is more aligned with what you want to do long term, but it's so low paying that the finances of it just don't make sense.
Mm-hmm. So if someone wants to get ahead of that, what would be the first step you should take?
Well, I wish that I could get a hold of everybody before they make their college decision, because I think a big part of it is having that conversation, whether it's, in the home or with teachers and college counselors, whomever it is, but having the conversation about what actually makes the most sense in terms of what you want to do long term, what your career ambitions are. And do you really need to go to XYZ college that costs so much money, or does it make more sense to go to the more affordable option or the options that's giving you scholarship money? Because we get really hung up on the name brand aspect of going to college. And a lot of times, as long as you're getting a good education and you're building a strong network, the name brand doesn't often matter a year out of college. That's definitely what I found. Also. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't find people ask me. I've been now in the business for 25 years. People don't say, "So, Doug, tell me about your schooling." They actually want to see results, and that someone knows what he's doing if he's going to be giving financial advice or working anywhere. So, let's say that someone does come out and he's stuck with a debt. What do you tell him?
Well, the first thing that you have to do is definitely face your numbers, which is probably the scariest part of the whole equation. And that's just taking a look at exactly how much debt you have. So many people have, 10, 12 different loans with different lenders and different interest rates. So you have to know the information before you can make an action plan. And then look at all your different resources. For some people, if they have all federal loans and if they're working in some sort of public service oriented position, they might be eligible for income driven repayment plans and a forgiveness program. Although, due to recent changes, I'm not sure I totally trust those anymore, if we're being honest. And then, other options such as refinancing, which moving your debt to a lower interest rate, but that turns everything into a private loan. So if you ever need a break, you don't quite have the same advantage as you do with federal loans. But the other thing too, I think we very much, especially within the personal finance community, we really focus on save, 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 pay down your debt, which is certainly not bad advice. But we also need to pivot to focus more on encouraging people to figure out how to earn more, how to advocate for themselves, how to negotiate. Most people don't even negotiate when they get their first job. They're just so grateful to even get a job offer that they don't bother to negotiate. So it's kind of figuring out how to teach people at a very young age to get a handle on this. And so it doesn't spiral out of control. You don't get deeper into debt and you just buck up, you face what the situation is, and you make your plan.
That sounds like very good advice. Listen, we are just about out of time. We've been talking to Erin Lowry, but in the last few seconds, Erin, tell us, how can people follow you and follow your work?
Absolutely. Well, you can find me at my site, brokemillennial.com. My book is in stores, nationwide in the United States and on Amazon as well. And you can follow me on Twitter at Broke Millennial or Instagram at Broke Millennial Blog.
Okay, we will put links to all of that at the show notes of today's show at goldsteinongelt.com. Erin Lowry, thanks so much for taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to the Goldstein on Gelt Show with money maven Doug Goldstein. Check out all of Doug's money ideas at goldsteinongelt.com. Doug specializes in helping people who live outside the United States handle their U.S. investment accounts. If you have a question that you would like answered on the air or off, contact Doug at his website or send him an email to doug@profile-financial.com.